Hello, welcome back to our 2023 Gather Bible Study on the 10 Commandments. This is the supplemental video to your magazine, which will have the full study in it. I'm Pastor Christa von Zychlin, and I'm pastor here at St. Luke in beautiful Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I thank you so much for joining me for this study all along and for this final session. Today we're talking about the last 3 or 4 commandments, depending on how you count them. All along, we've been talking about how the commandments maybe is a misnomer. These are God's teachings, and they still have relevance for us today. The commandments can be found in 2 places in the Bible, and today we're going to be looking at the way that they are listed in Exodus chapter 20. We're going to be talking about verse 15, you shall not steal. Verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female slave or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. We are using one of the principles of Bible study, which is that Scripture interprets Scripture. And there's massive amounts of Scripture that I've listed for you to look at in the actual Bible study. You're not going to get to all of them, but I hope that you will get to several of them, which really helps to show that there are no heroes in the Bible other than God and God alone. Again and again, we see God's people, even the ones that we are very famous, that we think of as being good people and great leaders, we see them again and again breaking those commandments in numerous ways. So there is no one who is perfect other than God alone. For fun and an icebreaker, I have suggested that you ask participants to bring a photo or symbol from your job, a church ministry, or a community activity which shows a way in which you help others to, quote, improve and protect their property and income. That would be relating to what we are calling the 7th commandment, you shall not steal. And in the Small Catechism, Martin Luther wrote that, what does this mean? We are to fear and love God so that we neither take our neighbor's money or property, nor acquire them by using shoddy merchandise or crooked deals. So Luther, you'll remember, is always saying what not to do, interpreting the commandment, and then goes on to say what is a positive way of keeping the commandment. So he goes on to say, but instead help them to improve and protect their property and income. So what is a way in which you or someone you know, or your congregation perhaps, is active in helping neighbors protect and enhance their property and income? And I just happen to know in our congregation, there are, I think, a couple of people who volunteer with low-income folks or aged folks to help them deal with this. Does this look familiar to everybody? This is that time of year, as I'm recording this, where people are filling out their U.S. individual income tax returns. And what a very practical idea for how do we keep that commandment about not stealing, to think about how do we accurately fill out our tax forms, and also helping folks to protect as much of their own income as they can. So I just think that's a lovely way in which some of the folks in our congregation are volunteering to help others to protect their property and income. And then my other show and tell item that I brought for the second one is I suggest that for the commandment not to covet, that you bring an advertisement or picture of something, hopefully not someone, that you covet, or perhaps are trying not to covet. So again, as an icebreaker, I'll be bringing in this photo of something that I covet. I think my life long, I have coveted a kitchen like this. And my kitchen does not look like this, I assure you, but this big window, lots of cabinet space, an island, and it just looks so lovely. So I am trying not to covet my neighbor's kitchen. So what kinds of things will you bring in just to get those juices flowing? Honestly, how do the commandments, even in small ways, relate to everyday life? The Godly Play program calls them not the 10 commandments, but the 10 best ways. And again, if you remember nothing else from this study, I hope that in looking at scripture and returning again and again to the actual words of the 10 commandments, you'll also join me in thinking about how do they continually push us to recognizing ourselves and finding ways to walk in a closer way with God, and also turning to him for that forgiveness that we need. One of my family's amazing discoveries since moving to New Mexico is White Sands National Park. It's one of the wonders of the world, with sparkling white sand dunes as far as the eye can see. While there are several easier and more popular paths, our favorite is the 5-mile Alkali Flat Trail. But there's a solemn warning sign at the start of the trail which greets us: bring at least 2 liters of water, follow the markers, don't go off the trail, people have died out here. Well, once beyond the parking lot, the views are spectacular. It's as if we're on another planet. We plow through the sand, slide through the dunes, marvel at purple mountains in the distance. We pause to catch our breath, drink water, and make sure that we're not out of sight of those trail markers. That's the really important thing, because the sands are always shifting. There is no one right trail. And that's part of the magic of that place, but also part of the challenge is to always keep the marker at least somewhere in sight, even if it's pretty far away. And I just think that's kind of a nice analogy for the 10 commandments. It's not marking a specific path for us to walk, because the sands of life are always changing. We always have new situations that come up. But one of the first stories that I'd like you to look at as part of the Bible study is right at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 3. And I have a marvelous picture here of our ancestors in the faith. It's called Who Will You Listen To? And it's from sanctifiedart.org by the artist is the Reverend Lauren Wright Pittman. Here is this picture. And here we see Adam and Eve, and in that garden, and they have managed, I would argue, to break not just 1 or 2 of the commandments, but pretty much all of the commandments at the same time with that first sin of Genesis 3. The 7th commandment is, you shall not steal. And it's amazing how much the scriptures talk about not stealing, and conversely being fair in all kinds of ways. In Leviticus, good old Leviticus 19, chapter 19, verse 13, you shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal. You shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. So even making people wait for their wages is an aspect of stealing. It's a pretty wide commandment that has to do with all our financial and material dealings. Just a little later in the chapter, verse 35, you shall not cheat in measuring length, weight, or quantity. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. Whatever those are. We'll have to look those up. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Okay, referring to what the Jewish tradition knows as the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt is the first saying in Jewish tradition, and here in Leviticus, it's bringing us back to the understanding that how we deal with material possessions and other people is very important to God. It's part of keeping God as God, is being honest in all our ways. Moving on to the book of Proverbs, chapter 20, verse 10. Diverse weights and diverse measures are both alike an abomination to the Lord. So it's not just that the Lord sort of doesn't like it if you cheat a little bit in your business dealings. It is an abomination. And then in verse 23, Proverbs 20, verse 23, differing weights are an abomination to the Lord, and false scales are not good. Yeah, so God cares about our business dealings. God cares passionately about those things. That brings us to the 8th commandment, which is the commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And this one, we're approaching a little bit differently. When is the time to speak the truth and when is the time to keep silent? As we read in Ecclesiastes, that famous reading from Ecclesiastes 3, which we've referred to several times in this study. For everything there's a season, a time for every matter under heaven. And then verse, where'd it go? Verse 7. A time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. So we're approaching it a little bit differently in this study, this commandment, because I'm having you look at a couple of the stories that are in which people loved their neighbors by not speaking or speaking up and maybe shading the truth a little bit. See what you think. I really appreciate, again, how our Luther's Small Catechism with African Descent reflections in writing about the 8th commandment say, besides straight up outright lying, these are some ways in which we lie and bear false witness today, using white lies to protect someone, telling people what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear, failing to tell something that ought to be told for the common good. Yeah, okay, so lots of important ways. It really is clearly a lifelong path or lifelong markers to wonder about when is the time to do it this way and when is the time to do it that way. And that's why we need each other in community to think about that or to study the scriptures together. And we always, always need truth tellers among us, people who will interrupt our groupthink ways. And that brings us to the last 2 commandments, which I have put together, and many people do. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, nor your neighbor's wife, nor male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Many of us do not appreciate the way that your neighbor's wife is just kind of, or male or female slave are just kind of put in there together with ox and donkey and house. But maybe there's a poetic wisdom to that as well, because when we covet, we are objectifying. And so maybe buried in this commandment is something that calls us to say, oh, yeah, when I'm coveting a person or coveting a thing, again, I'm not putting it into the context in which God calls me to put it into the context of, which is the context of loving God and loving neighbor. So the the commandment on not coveting, by the way, covet is such a weird word, isn't it? It's like, I've never heard anyone use that word in regular language, but sometimes it's nice to have kind of strange words because they are teaching us a different way to look at things. So again, covet, it's a sin of the heart that's being addressed, whereas kind of many of these commandments are like, don't steal, don't kill, they're more objective understandings of that. But this is bringing us back to that first commandment of who is God? Who is God for us? So we always go back to that commandment. In the New Testament, Jesus has a lovely story that I think refers to coveting, even though the word covet doesn't appear in the story. In Luke 12:13-21, you know it. It's when the one brother comes to Jesus and says, "Hey, make my other brother share the inheritance with me." Then Jesus goes on to tell the story of the rich fool who just builds bigger and bigger barns. And what use is it when the next day he dies? And so it's drawing us back, the commandment against coveting and Jesus' story here to this guy who's all anxious about an inheritance. It's bringing us back to those ultimate questions. Who is your God? And what is the thing that you're fixing your eyes upon? And that brings us to one of the last readings, which is from Philippians. And Paul talks in Philippians 4 about rejoicing in the Lord. And then he talks about he's so grateful for the gift that has been given to him by the wider church. But he's saying, I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little. I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry and of having plenty and of being in need. And then that great verse, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So again, it's the scriptures as they interpret scripture are calling us back into that relationship with God and with neighbor. And then Paul goes on to say, in any case, it was kind of you to share my distress. So he's calling us back to the relationship with God and the relationship with neighbor. And that's what the 10 Commandments are all about. And I would like to end with just a reading from the Bible study itself, where I wrote, many Christians make the mistake of thinking that the Old Testament is all about law and the New Testament is about love. This is actually a form of bearing false witness about the Hebrew scriptures, or what we know as the Old Testament. As we've studied the 10 Commandments together, we've seen how Old Testament laws are better called teachings. They're a gift from God to the ancient wandering Israelites and continue to reflect God's love for God's people today, serving as path markers for lives of goodness. Blessings to you in your studies and especially in your community as you continually come back to the scriptures and discuss what do they mean for our very real lives and how we can best love our neighbors today. Thank you so much for joining me, and God bless you and your studies and your walk with God and with each other. Bye-bye.